The burden of government spending has exploded in the past 10 years in America, and it is expected to become even more onerous in the next 10 years. What does this mean for the U.S. economy? I'm Dan Mitchell of the Cato Institute, and this Center for Freedom and Prosperity video is going to discuss the Rahn curve. As you can see on the screen, the Rahn curve shows the relationship between the economy on the vertical axis and government spending, measured as a share of gross domestic product, on the horizontal axis. When there is no government, the graph shows that economic output or growth is very low. This is because in a state of anarchy, workers, savers, investors, and entrepreneurs do not have an environment conducive to productive behavior. But as government begins to provide core public goods such as rule of law and protection of property rights, economic performance improves. Simply stated, people have a much greater incentive to produce when they know there are rules protecting life, liberty, and property. But just like some food is good but overeating is bad, the same thing is true for government spending. The Rahn curve shows that there is a growth maximizing level of government spending, but once the budget exceeds that point, economic performance begins to slip. The Rahn curve, which is named after Cato Institute fellow Richard Rahn, is sort of the spending equivalent of the Laffer curve. In both cases, it is a very bad idea to be on the right side or downward sloping side of the graph. In the case of the Laffer curve, it means tax rates are so high that the government actually loses revenue because people decide to earn and or report less income. In the case of the Rahn curve, it means that government is too big and this is reducing prosperity. The most challenging question, of course, is figuring out whether government today is too big or too small. In other words, where is America on the Rahn curve? We're going to flash a bunch of academic studies on the screen that show estimates of the growth maximizing level of government spending. Now feel free at any point to pause the video if you want to examine the findings of any particular study. But you'll notice that what you see is that scholars generally conclude that economic performance is maximized when government spending is somewhere between 15% of GDP and 25% of GDP. Now, the fact that there is such a wide range of estimates should not be too surprising. Economists are notorious for disagreeing with each other, and to be fair, this kind of empirical research is a big challenge since there are many other policies, including taxation, monetary policy, regulation, and trade policy, that also impact economic performance. But you, the viewer, only need to understand one thing. Government spending in America today consumes 40% of GDP. In other words, the budget is way above the growth maximizing level, even if you assume that 25% of GDP is the right amount. And other nations, by the way, are in even bigger trouble, particularly places such as France, where the burden of government spending exceeds 50% of economic output. It is quite likely, by the way, that the right size of government is closer to 15% or even lower. The statistical studies you saw on the screen are constrained by a lack of data for countries with limited governments. Even relatively laissez-faire economies such as Hong Kong have government sectors that consume nearly 20% of GDP. So what does it really tell us when researchers conclude that economic growth is maximized when government spending is about where it is in Hong Kong? Would the results be different if we had examples of countries with smaller government? There's no way to answer that question, but here's some food for thought. Let's look at this chart using data from an International Monetary Fund study showing that most nations in Europe and North America had very modest levels of government for much of their histories, oftentimes consuming only about 10% of GDP. In America, for example, total government spending until the 1930s averaged less than 10% of GDP. Does anybody really think, though, that America would have grown faster in the 1800s and early 1900s if the burden of government spending was doubled from 10% of GDP to 20% of economic output? Or let's ask the same question about England or Sweden. The answer almost surely is no. And this means that the academic studies on the Rahn curve today are almost certainly overstating the growth maximizing level of government. For all intents and purposes, today's research may be measuring the downward sloping portion of the Rahn curve. Let's conclude with the one thing we can say for sure. Government today is far too big, and this is hurting growth. undermining prosperity and reducing competitiveness. It doesn't matter whether Republicans are spending too much money or Democrats are spending too much money. And it doesn't matter whether we're looking at America or other nations. If we want a strong economy, the Rahn curve tells us that we need to dramatically reduce the burden of government spending. I'm Dan Mitchell. On behalf of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, thanks for watching this video, and please share it with your friends and colleagues.